All right, I'm gonna have Ginger. Where are you from, and what's your question?
Oh, hi, Dr. Goldhamer. I'm from Schenectady. I'm living in Florida now. Thank you so much. Great presentation. Dr. Goldhamer, this conference is called The Real Truth About Health. And yet they've had experts on all week, like Dr. Gabriel Cousins and Dr. Brian Clement, who claim that not only should food not be cooked, but we shouldn't even be eating complex carbohydrates, and that even fruit causes cancer. And other doctors have said things like oil is good for us, and that salt is essential. So could you please now tell the real truth about fruit, oil, and salt?
Sure. Now, isn't it great, though, that all of these different ideas and thoughts can be brought together in one place so we can all have discussions about the various merits and thoughts and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's wonderful. I think it's good for us to hear kind of all sides of all of it. All I can do is share with you, my experience, what I've learned and what I've seen in the 40 years that I've been fasting, the 25,000 people that have been through the True North Health Center. And we do use a whole food diet, which includes whole fruit, vegetables, as well as non-glutinous whole grains and beans, as well as nuts and seeds. And we found that provides a diet that's around 10% of calories from protein, around 15 to 18% of calories from fat, and the balance of foods from whole plant food complex carbohydrates. And that's the diet that's consistent with the studies that we're publishing, showing not only short-term recovery from health, but long-term maintenance of health. And that's an important point, because many of the things that are advocated that you might use short-term, you wouldn't use long-term. Like you wouldn't say, just stay on a water fast forever. That wouldn't work. You're not designed to be on a water-only fast. You can put people on fasting mimicking diets, but a high-protein, high-fat diet may not be a good long-term solution, even if you get some short-term benefit of weight loss or whatever it is you're doing with your therapeutic intervention. The human being is designed, in my opinion, to eat complex carbohydrates with enough fat and protein so that they meet their optimum needs. And that's exactly what happens when you give people a diet exclusively of whole plant foods, as I've described. And so these are people with cancer that are recovering, people that are preventing those diseases. One of the things I see in my patients now, remember, I'm getting patients that are 35-year follow-ups now. So we've been working them since they were in their 50s. Now they're in their mid-80s. And the most common thing they're telling me is that they've outlived everybody they know, in many cases, including their kids that didn't adopt a healthy diet. So we're seeing that, yes, people can live a long and healthy life. They tend to have close proximity to their debility, so they're not ending up in nursing home beds for 10 years. They're living functional and vital until they reach their potential and hopefully go to sleep one night and don't wake up. And many of the leaders that advocate whole plant food diets, you see them in their late 80s now, sharp as tacks, people like Dr. Campbell, just doing a fabulous job practicing what they preach, as well as, setting a good example of what happens, in later ages. And that's what we're seeing as people age out at a much healthier, in a much healthier way. I would express extreme caution for going on long-term, high-protein, high-fat animal-based diets, even though they may have a fasting mimicking hunger blunting effect because of the induction of ketosis. That's not necessarily anything that's been shown to be consistent with preventing or treating cancer long-term or avoiding other diseases of dietary excess.
So to Ginger's point, the Real Truth About Health conference does invite people with different points of view, experience, and interpretations of the research. And I want to use that to highlight something that Dr. Joel Kahn, who was just on before you, brought up. And he said that the CardioPrev study had basically showed that oil, specifically in this case olive oil, it was a Mediterranean diet, was healthier than lower fat diets that excluded oil. Are you familiar with that study, and what's your interpretation of that?
You got to be careful too, though, because it's really easy to make errors of attribution when you're doing these broad epidemiological studies, because something like olive oil may be less bad than something else. So if you're displacing higher amounts of animal protein, for example, with higher amounts of olive oil, I'm not going to argue that olive oil may be less bad than animal food. And so you have to look at it in a pretty broad view to be able to form conclusions. And even then, it's very difficult, whether it's plant-based foods or animal-based foods, to form definitive conclusions based on large-scale epidemiological studies, and particularly in an area of whole plant foods, because remember, 93% of calories have nothing to do with whole plant foods that are consumed by people, including in these studies. So even these studies that are arguing, oh, these are vegetarian diets or whatever compared to other diets, those vegetarian diets are not whole plant food diets. I can assure you, we've got adherence data when we're looking even at our own population about what people are actually consuming. And we do not have reliable data what happens when people actually eat dominantly whole plant food diets. What you have is what happens when people eat highly processed foods that don't have animal food or that don't have cottonseed oil, or these are not necessarily healthy diets. In fact, we did a study recently where we had biomarkers identified, and we were going to find some healthy people and see what happens with fasting. I mentioned that. The problem is the people that came in that thought they were healthy didn't measure out healthy as based on their biomarkers. The only people we really could find to meet those targets turned out to be people living at True North Health Center that were working there and eating the diet consistently. It was really hard to find people that are biologically healthy. It's thought that as much as 12% of the population currently are biologically healthy, but it's really hard to find that 12%, particularly when you go and enroll them in studies.
And what are the markers that you would look for people to
There's
be?
a variety of biomarkers. If you're interested, you can go to fasting.org and you can see the study that we published where it goes through all the technical biomarkers. And we looked at everything from acute phase-reactive proteins and things like CRP and inflammatory markers to your basic lipid levels and sugar levels and blood pressure. And there's all kinds of ways of assessing health. But however you do it, I can assure you it's difficult to find populations of people that are eating that way, particularly if they're not eating whole plant food diets.
Great, thank you. So if someone eats a raw food diet of sprouts and green vegetables, which is obviously, much better than what's being eaten out there, and then they go and they add 3 tablespoons a day of, I don't know, good quality, I don't even know what that means, good quality oil to that raw food salad, what is the negative effect to our health? How significant?
What I would argue is that as beneficial as that diet likely is, by avoiding meat, fish, fowl, eggs, dairy products, and all the other processed foods, it might be even better if rather than getting those grams from a highly processed fractionated oil, even a quote good oil, if they were to use whole foods, I would argue nuts, seeds, flax seeds, avocado, whatever it is that they decided was their source of whole plant food, I'd argue there'd be additional benefit, but it's incremental. In other words, you can't compare the difference between olive oil or avocado compared to greasy, slimy, dead, decaying flesh and Oreo cookies. There's such a huge difference there that the difference between the olive oil and the avocado may not be obvious. You may need to do fairly critical analysis to be able to detect that difference. Whereas the difference between a standard American diet and any kind of semblance of a decent, healthy diet is going to be fairly huge. So sometimes we get into arguments over things that maybe we don't really need to be arguing about. If you'd rather have some highly fractionated processed oil and you're biologically healthy, I don't care. If your weight is targeted, you're doing all, but that's not who I'm seeing. I'm seeing people that are struggling with weight loss, and it turns out all you have to do is take the oil and the sugar and the salt out of the diet, feed the same basic diet, and now they thrive. I think Chef AJ talks a lot about her transition where she was doing the vegetarian thing but struggling with weight loss and adopted our way of eating for a while and became what she calls a skinny bitch because she was able to lose that additional weight, despite the fact she had already been trying to eat healthy, but that difference was enough for her to be healthy. And she talks a lot about that and does a good job in her work kind of advocating that. So if you're thriving and you're healthy and you're having your 3 tablespoons of olive oil, I'm not going to give you a hard time about it. I'm just saying that there's good and then there's great. And so we always strive for great. And people that are sick have no choice but to strive for great because, it doesn't work for them.
So again, going back to the variety of people that we've had here having different opinions on different things, Brian Clement insists that fruit has been bred to be sweeter than it was in nature and that it feeds yeast, mold, fungus, candida, and cancer. Do you see any relationship between fruit and any of these health issues?
I completely agree with Brian in some things, which is that fruit are hybridized, they're high sugar, low mineral content products now. Like if you look at the wild apples in Hawaii, they look more like vegetables, lower sugar, higher fiber content. And so if we're going to include fruit in the diet, I do think we don't want to just eat a fruitarian type diet. On the other hand, I think there's plenty of room in the diet of a healthy person, including people fighting cancer and other problems, for some whole fruit. I particularly like things like berries and melons and things like of that nature. And when you eat fruit, you have to eat large amounts of raw vegetables, in my opinion, in order to get the kind of fiber to slow the rate of sugar absorption so you don't get overloaded by the fact that these fruits do tend to be little sugar balls nowadays. Some less so than others. Things like berries and melons have a lower glycemic response than some other things. And we don't use fruit. We're not advocating fruit juices, dried fruits, and all these highly processed versions of fruit and fruit sugars and bee vomit and maple syrup and all these concentrated sweeteners that are so commonly used. It's not the whole fruit that's the limiting factor. Now, having said that, if you're particularly concerned about that, you can skip the whole fruit, eat more vegetables, and you're still going to do just fine. But I don't see any reason for the majority of patients to eliminate completely whole fruit from their diet, so long as it's in conjunction with large amounts of vegetable material. I think the response that they're getting is to people that are eating dominantly fruit-based diets, and that doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. And do you recommend that we eat raw seeds, nuts, avocados, and olives? And if so, what percentage of our
I'm
diet?
not an olive advocate, because to make it palatable, they salt the process. They're highly salted, and I'm not an advocate of added fractionated salt in the diet. So olives, because of the salt contamination, just like you can make pickles without salt, but if you eat commercial pickles, they're really high in sodium. So I argue against those. As far as what were the other?
It was raw seeds, nuts, avocados, and
Well,
olives.
yeah, seeds. One thing you want, if you actually want to absorb the seed, you may need to process those seeds by sprouting or grinding them, because you may find, if you notice seeds in your stool, then that means they didn't go back together. It means that they never got torn apart, and your teeth aren't particularly efficient at chewing seeds. And so sometimes you have to grind those to a powder if your intent is to absorb them. But I have no problem with raw seeds and nuts. The thing is, they're very rich, so I'd recommend that they be used in limited quantities. We recommend not more than an ounce a day of most of those products.
And what do you say to people who would respond to your prescription about salt, that we have receptors on our tongues, which shows that we're supposed to eat salt? What is wrong with salt?
Well, we have receptors on our tongues that are for sugar and for everything else too. Salt is an essential nutrient without which you die. And it turns out you get all the salt you need from a varied whole plant food diet, just like you get all the fats you need and all the carbohydrates you need and all the protein you need. You don't need to take salt, highly process it, fractionate it, and then put it back in to artificially stimulate dopamine in the brain. And think about what salt is. Salt is a preservative. That's why they used to salt things like meat, to keep the bacteria from breaking it down. You're going to take a high salt diet and put it into a bacteria-rich gut. What do you think affects the microbiome more than a high salt intake? It's going to be profound. It's also it stimulates what's called passive overeating. If you take an animal or a human and just have it eat till it's full naturally of anything, say rice, it'll eat a certain amount, then it feels full, it feels satiated. Everything else being equal, take that same animal, the same food, and salt it, it'll eat significantly more before it stops and feels satiated. And people say, yeah, because it tastes better. Well, what do you think tasting better means? It means stimulating more dopamine production in the brain. It fools the brain to overeating. And that's how you get fat. If you take the salt away, it gets much more difficult to consistently overeat on these foods, because you stop fooling the normal mechanisms of the brain that keep you from becoming fat and sick. So what we say is, don't eat salt, and then you're less likely to even eat the highly processed foods. Because you know what bread is without salt? It's called matzah. It's punishment on Passover. Nobody's going out buying a bunch of matzah and getting fat. So what it is, you add the oil, you add the salt to enhance the loss of flavor that happens in highly processed foods. You get rid of the SOS, and you find out really what whole foods are, and you find out why people are really having trouble with weight.